stream.
It's live stream, so we don't know if they're there. Okay.
It's not available.
Okay, that's fine.
I keep forgetting to. Hello? It's
Hi.
on.
We can mute you if you want for now.
That was fun.
This one. All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you all so much for coming to a seminar. So today it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Saleska, who is a professor in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Arizona in the United States. In addition to that, he's faculty for the University of Arizona's Institute of the Environment and a fellow in the Environment and Social Justice. So the reason that Scott's here visiting us today is that his work really sits at the interface between biogeochemistry, So that's fluxes of things like carbon and nitrogen through ecosystems and ecology. In particular, Scott works on how ecosystems are both affected by and affect climate change. So he's worked in very diverse ecosystems, from the Arctic and alpine systems through to the Amazon, and looking particularly at how forests, trees, plants, and soils respond to changes in climate. So the work should be really relevant to a lot of what we do, and also relevant currently given the current events that are going on in both the Amazon and the Congo right now with deforestation. So without further ado, let me introduce Scott and welcome him to ICRAF.
Thank you, Christine. It's a particular pleasure to be here today, not only because of all of you and getting to know Africa a little bit, know a few parts of Kenya, but because it's been an honor to reconnect with Christine, who was a student of mine when she was a PhD student at the University of Arizona. So it's been great to see you again. I don't think I've actually been in the same room with her since her defense in 2012. So it's great pleasure. And a great pleasure to meet the folks here. I've just had a sampling at the soil lab, and I hope to get a chance to talk to folks a little bit more as we go along. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is what you see here, the function of the Amazon in the face of deforestation in particular, but also with connections to fire and climate change. And the actual work that I'm going to talk about that I've been involved with is very closely tied to work that has been led by Elizabeth Garcia and Abby Swan, who are colleagues of mine at the University of Washington, who are modelers. I do some modeling, but not they do large-scale models, which we are actually using in some of this work to connect to mostly the empirical work that I do. I make measurements of things in ecosystems and how they couple to climate. Well, so here we see a dramatic picture of what happened a few months ago in central southwest Amazon in Rondônia, Brazil. And this sparked a huge outcry of concern around the world because this was a surge that hadn't been seen in many years. Well, let me see. Let me just skip over that and say that today's talk is going to focus on some of that aspect. This is what we're not focusing on. This is an intact primary forest where I do a lot of my work. That's me on the tower there, where we use this tower to make measurements of carbon dioxide and particularly relevant for today, water and energy fluxes. But we will be focusing on the part where that's not, and the question about what's happening to the Amazon today. It's still today. And so here are some dramatic photos that were in the news. Fires in the Amazon rainforest have surged this year. This was from just a few weeks ago, so it's still going on. Most of these fires have been set by farmers clearing their land, and which are also burning into places that are newly being deforested. So this is the same time that there was some concern about the fires here. My understanding of the distinction is that a lot of the fires here were in savanna lands, and a lot of the fires in the Amazon were places that are primary forest, which aren't supposed to burn ecologically, unlike savanna. Okay, so this is the article from a few weeks ago, October. Deforestation in Brazil's Amazon surges through September. So it's still going on. We're still in the dry season for many parts of the Amazon when this is still happening. Well, like I said, this created a huge surge of concern. The president of France, where I'm currently living for a few months on sabbatical, tweeted this on Twitter: "Our house is burning, literally. The Amazon rainforest, the lungs which produce 20% of our planet's oxygen, is on fire. It's an international crisis." This tweet created some pushback or blowback because, for one thing, this picture was from the 1990s, not from the recent fires, although there were plenty of pictures that looked just the same as from now. And also a thing about oxygen and so I just want to ask people, I've heard this a lot, you guys work on conservation, is burning, deforestation, or even fossil fuel burning, is this something you're concerned about because it puts at risk our oxygen supply? How many people worry about this or think this is something we should be concerned about? How many people don't think this is the thing to be worried about among the many things? So people, you're saying no, right? What are you thinking? Yes. You're shaking your head like.
I'm thinking carbon sequestration, so not oxygen directly, but in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
So greenhouse gas emissions more than oxygen. And that's about right. So if you look at this is what's happened over the last 40 years, and about 15% increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since 1990, about 90% from fossil fuel burning, about 10% from deforestation. So that's a big change, and that's what's driving our concern about global climate change. And of course, when you burn something, you consume oxygen. Carbohydrate plus oxygen makes CO2 and H2O. So there should be a corresponding decline in oxygen, one for one practically, molecule for molecule of CO2 that's emitted results in a molecule of oxygen consumed. And so then you can look at the symmetrical opposite pattern of oxygen in the atmosphere like this. But there's one key difference is you're starting with only a few hundred parts per million of CO2, so a few parts per million can add up. A few parts per million of oxygen on top of about 21% oxygen in the atmosphere is really negligible. So over this 15-year time period where there was a 15% increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, there was a 0.01% decline in oxygen. It's the same molecule for molecule, but molecule for molecule on top of 20% is a lot less as a fraction. So over these 25 years, it went from 20.946% oxygen in the atmosphere to 20.935% in the atmosphere. So that's not doing too much. But what if we keep this up? But if we keep this up for, say, 250 years, that is multiplying this by 10, will go down, instead of 0.1%, it'll go down 0.1%. That is all the way down to 20.835%. And so that's really not the risk from these activities. And in fact, if we vaporized the whole biosphere, all 600 gigatons of vegetation, all 2,500 or so gigatons of soils, that's over 3,000 gigatons of carbon, and corresponded that to oxygen, we'd be declining the atmosphere, oxygen in the atmosphere by a whole 0.74%, which is huge compared to these numbers, but it really is not going to put at risk our ability to breathe. So that's not the reason we're concerned about deforestation and about burning in the Amazon. And so this was a little brouhaha in the news, so I said there are many, many reasons to be concerned, nay, terrified by the resurgence of deforestation and burning, but risk to the world's oxygen supply is not one of them. You probably all knew this already. But it's something I think it's very important that we try to speak honestly and accurately about the science behind our concerns for environmental problems, because people have said, in response to this quote, you shouldn't say that because this is something that has really animated people and made people concerned about this, and it's a good, useful organizing tool. Well, ultimately, I think that's a bad strategy if you're going to be trying to use basically false information, because eventually somebody's going to call you on it, and then you're going to look even, it's not going to be helpful then. Okay, so why should we be concerned? So I want to say, what is the story on deforestation? And if it's not the oxygen supply, what is the value of the Amazon? And what I'm going to focus on is water cycling and the function of Amazon in South America, as well as, in this part 3, global ecoclimate teleconnections. Our hypothesis here is no tree is an island, which I'll describe in a moment. And then at the end, some ideas about what we need to do about it. Okay, so here's the story. Here's a picture of South America, and the purple areas are areas of tree cover loss over that 17-year time period. And you can see there's this extensive loss along this southeastern flank of the Amazon. We often call this is the Amazon, all this green. And we call this the arc of deforestation. There's other hot spots of deforestation in other forests, but in this tropical belt, this is where most of it is happening. And then there's some internal areas like this that are away from the margins that are having significant deforestation. Here's a zoom in of this area. This is this is a port that has been set up to export soy, and so these lands have been converted to large-scale soy farms. Most of them are down here, but there's a road that comes up through here to this port, and so this road is along this edge of this national forest, which is more or less preserved, but you can see there's a big change between the preserved part and the unpreserved part. And Actually, I would do my work where that tower was right here in that little green patch. So that's what's, for the moment, intact primary forest. It's supposedly protected because it's in a national forest, but who knows with the way things are going now in Brazil. So here's a picture of the overall rates of deforestation going back to the late 80s. And you can see what's happening now. Well, this was last year, 2018. This year, this is annual rates up to on a scale of 30,000 square kilometers per year lost. On this side is the percentage of forest that was there in 1970 that's remaining. So it's gone down to about 80%. We've lost about 20% since 1970. And you can see that there really was a lot of deforestation 15 years ago. And it was declining a lot until the last few years. And in particular, so my first visit to the Amazon was in 1999. And the first few years I was there, this was a huge concern. Everybody was talking about deforestation. And in the last few years, they haven't been until this year. Because this year, this is what happened. This is a little bit different. This is every month, the amount of deforestation, because we don't have 19 in yet for the full year. But we can see there's a huge difference in 2019 from the previous year. And this is probably due to the change in politics of Brazil and the election of Jair Bolsonaro, who's sort of like a Trump-like character in Brazil. The tropical Trump, they call him. The people who don't like him. All my colleagues don't like him for this obvious reason. And so he was very open about the fact that he wanted to develop the Amazon and stop with this namby-pamby worry about environmental protection. And here is a quote from when he was a candidate. I won't allow Brazil's environmental enforcement agency to go around issuing fines. What business is of them? They're an environmental governmental enforcement agency. Why are they issuing fines? The party is going to end. The party being the party of law enforcement. And since he took office in January, the agency says it has issued 30% fewer fines this year, and so this is the result of that. And when he saw this bar for July of 2019, he said, I'm convinced the data is a lie. Fake news. We're going to call the president of INPA here and talk about this issue, and that's the end of the issue. INPA is the Brazilian space agency. It's like it's like in NASA in the US. It is the gold standard for monitoring deforestation around the world, but in particular in the Amazon. This has been a result of satellite products and data analysis that has come to fruition there that was actually a key part, as I'll say later, in that decline in deforestation, the ability to technologically see where deforestation is happening right away and get to help enforcement. Well, so the president of INPE, in response to when he said this, said the data was a lie. He said, it is outrageous that the president of this country is calling scientists who have no ability to defend themselves and whose work and integrity is beyond reproach. He is a coward. He said this publicly. The president of Brazil was a coward. And so it wouldn't be surprising that this is the news a few days later. This is Richard Galvão, the director or president of INPA, behind a satellite image of the Amazon, and he was ousted after this data came out, August 2nd. So that's the situation in Brazil. It's a confluence of all the pressures that are always there with this sort of complete breakdown on the political side. So why should we be concerned about this? If it's not if it's not oxygen, what is it? Now, I'm sure you guys are experts in this. You can reel off lots of things. What things would you say are the reasons to be concerned about the Amazon, if not oxygen supply? Or, for that matter, the Congo, or biodiversity. That's, as a biologist, as an ecologist, that's probably like the number one thing on my list, even though that's not what I study for the most part. Anything else? Temperature regulation, or climate regulation more generally, yeah. That's actually what we're going to talk about in a minute. And you probably you have funders and people who come in here, and you're presumably all the time coming up with these are ecosystem services, we need to preserve them. You're probably well honed in your arguments. Here's just a list of some of them. In the Amazon, we have about 1/10 of all species on Earth, 1/2 of all tropical tree species, 16,000 by last count or last estimate. that's really, that's the legacy of 100 million years of the evolution of land plants and the habitats for other organisms. That is, we all know this is irreplaceable, something we can't maybe quantify as easily as some other things or make as obvious, but it's like probably the driver of a lot of our concerns. But as we just heard, climate regulation is another thing. Aside from the biological diversity, there's a function to all that diversity. It's cycling carbon, and for example, losing the Amazon would prevent the possibility of even achieving what was sort of a minimalist, I think, climate step, which was the Paris Agreement, because it would cause a bump up in the atmospheric CO2 concentrations. The other thing that's less talked about, which I think in some ways is equally as important, and I am going to talk about today, is the water and energy balance caused by different kinds of vegetation. The Amazon River is the largest river on Earth. 1/5 of all the fresh water, of all the rain that falls on the land and flows to the ocean, all around the world, 1/5 of it flows out the mouth of the Amazon. It's larger than the next largest 8 rivers combined in all the world. The Nile is a little longer, so you can say the Nile is the biggest by length, but the Amazon is the largest by volume. And since all that water is flowing out of the Amazon, that water has to come from somewhere. And it comes from atmospheric transport of water vapor, which you can think of as a river in the sky that has even more flow of water vapor than the largest river on Earth, because it's the supply for the water that's coming out. And the reason it's able to be sustained is because of recycling rainwater from evaporating, transpiring trees, and this stimulates ecoclimate teleconnections, which I'm about to talk about. But these are sort of, in some sense, these are rationalizations, after-the-fact rationalizations, for why we think we should be concerned about this. Our first, I think almost anybody in this room, when you see or are concerned about the devastation of the environment, whether it's the Amazon or in Africa or wherever, I'm sure you're not sort of calculating the carbon balance as the thing you have to do before you feel a concern. And so when I asked my daughter this, she just said, it's the frickin' Amazon. And she didn't do any of these sort of thinking about the calculations of the carbon balance or water. And so here she is. She actually has some basis for knowing about this a little bit. We had a kids course where they were studying the different traits of palms in one place. And here she's in my field site. We're about 30 meters above the ground in this walkway in the canopy. So this is that same place where you saw that eddy flux tower. So that's the real reason I think we're concerned. We have this, E.O. Wilson called it biophilia, this sort of instinctive appreciation and love for this kind of environment when we see it. But we're scientists, so we come up with other things. We don't come up with them, they're real, but and that's what I'm going to talk about now, in particular the water and energy balance. Here's a picture, a cartoon of water recycling. Forest trees are a pump for returning rain to the atmosphere. And so here we see rain falling on forests. Trees evapotranspire, putting what fell as rain back into the atmosphere as water vapor, which can then recondense and fall as rain again. And this is about a supply of about 1/3 of all the rain that falls in the Amazon comes from water recycled by the trees. And I read recently a paper by Meini van Noordwijk, who also talks about this phenomenon, who I guess you guys know, he's from here, and they introduced the interesting idea, which I didn't give different names to these different kinds of water, but they call this is blue water that's falling as rain in the environment. This is green water that's evapotranspiring because it came through the greenery, the trees, and up here in the atmosphere is the rainbow water, because that's the water that makes for rainbows. So that's a nice mnemonic for thinking about this mechanism. Okay, so of course, if you deforest trees, you lose some of that recycling capacity and capability, and you slow the recycling and with possible climatic implications. And I just want to show a picture of, at a global scale, of the dynamics that we get from this. So this is an animated picture from a model-assisted assimilation of data that's showing the dynamics, and the gray there is not clouds. It's a visualization of the actual amount of water vapor. So the more white there is, the more water vapor there is, and you can see the general trend is this movement across from east to west, which is the intertropical convergence zone of water moving basically, or atmospheric circulation moving in the opposition to the circulation of the Earth. And you can see there's this huge flux. This is that atmospheric river that's carrying more water than the Amazon itself does, flowing in. You can see it sort of hits the Amazon and gets diverted and sort of flows down to the south and comes back out to the ocean here. So that recycling is sustaining not only the Amazon to some extent, but also these vegetation areas down here, which are the breadbasket of Brazil. This is actually the place in the descending limb of the Hadley cell that should make it a desert. If you look at other places, you see the southern African desert, you see the Australian desert. On the coast, you can see a little bit of dryness over here on the other side of the Andes. But here it's mostly green because it's getting this flux of water that's being transported by the Amazon rainforest that's supplying that rain. So that's a nice, good visualization that gives you a sense for the global, its part in the global cycle. Here's a picture from a recent study that looked at how this was distributed. So here's the distribution of forest transpiration throughout the Amazon. This is actually the most heavily forested part, so it has less transpiration. Why would that be? This area has no dry season, basically. It's all wet. It's saturated air, very low vapor pressure deficit, which is what drives VPD. So even though it's the wettest part, it doesn't have as high a VPD as the areas that are drier that also have a lot of water and therefore have a gradient through the VPD to drive transpiration fluxes. Well, here's an interesting picture, which is, I think, the key part of this paper, which is the fraction of the rainfall that comes from recycled transpiration. So you can see that, from that other animation, you saw that the air was mostly coming in here, bringing water vapor, which then recycles, and then so by the other time, during one part of the season, air is coming in this direction. As the ITC moves down, it comes this direction. So this doesn't get much recycling, but it supplies the rain that falls here or there. And one way to look at that, and this is what I call the breadbasket of South America. This is where this agricultural region that's really a strong contributor, not only to Brazil, but also other countries in South America. And the world, if you're talking about export of soy. So these rivers, I said we called atmospheric rivers, or some people call them flying. My colleague Antonio Nobre calls them flying rivers. They carry water, but if you burn the forest, they can also carry the ash. And so in August 19th of this year, this is Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is down here, way away from the Amazon. There was a cold front that came in that brought a storm, but the storm rained rain full of soot. And it was soot because it was carrying ash from the burning in the Amazon that was being carried by the atmospheric river. And you can see this very clearly in this animation. Not this one, but this one, which is a map. This is a picture over over a few weeks in South America of carbon monoxide measured by satellites. And so you can see this is the carbon monoxide that's generated by the burning in the rainforest, and then you can see there's a pulse that goes up out over the Pacific Ocean, but another pulse that shoots down. Here's Sao Paulo. Boom, it gets that. And that happened those same few days. This is August 8th to 22nd, and that is the 19th. And so that is now clearly been documented that this rainfall of ash in Sao Paulo state, far to the south of the Amazon, is the consequence of the burning. Here, by the way, is the burning in Africa, same time. Up here is probably fossil fuel burning from industrial uses. Okay, so here is another, I thought to put this in a global context, this recycling, this great paper from a few years ago now, but illustrates both the source and the sink of that recycled rainwater. So up here, so this gives you the global context. What this map shows is the precipitation that falls everywhere and the fraction of that precipitation that comes from recycled rain that evapotranspired upwind So this is the precipitation sink, where evapotranspired water falls as precip. The colors are the fraction of precip that was recycled from somewhere upwind, from evapotranspiration. And so you can see this is an annual average, so it's a little different from the other one, but it shows that this area in the south of Brazil is getting a huge amount of its rain, over 50%, 70% or so, from recycled rain that is there because of the Amazon. And you also see this in the western part of Africa. But the really interesting thing is this map, which shows this is the source of that rain. This shows the rain, this shows the evapotranspiration that gives rise to that source. So here, basically, these hot spots here are upwind of the hot spots here, because these are supplying. So here, it's the coastal regions of Brazil that are the hot spots that are supplying the hot spot down here as we saw, the air comes in and goes down there. And we're seeing the same thing here. The Eastern Africa is the source of the rain that's falling in Western Africa. So the Congo and regions west are probably helped by what we do here in Kenya. And of course, there's a huge effect in Asia. The Tibetan Plateau is a real hot spot, although it's not as, it's a large fraction of a smaller amount then, but it's supplying rain to other parts of Asia, in the northeastern China. And you can see the effect a little bit in North America, where there's a big precipitation source on the west coast. The prevailing winds here are going from west to east, and some of that falls over here, and the evapotranspiration comes from here. Okay, so that's the global context for that. So now I want to talk about some serious work we did in trying to model this in a sophisticated way to represent what we call ecoclimate teleconnections, why forests matter for climate protection around the world. You know, one thing, sometimes when you go back and you come up with a great idea for a study, you think, oh, this is so, I'm so smart, I came up with this cool idea. And then you go back and you look in the literature and you say, oh, well, actually, 30 years ago, somebody else came up with this idea, and we just forgot about it, and now I'm just sort of doing it over again. So in terms of ecoclimate teleconnections, we went way back in the literature, and we sort of went all the way to John Donne, the British poet, who in 1623 wrote a poem that is somewhat well known, called No Man is an Island. And the first few lines of it go, no man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. This was probably remembered. How many people have heard of this here? I don't know. This is British poetry. This is a British colonial region, so maybe. I learned it in high school. And the reason it's most famous is because the last line of this was used by Ernest Hemingway in his Spanish Civil War novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. So it ends, "Send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Well, anyway, this is not just poetry, it's a hypothesis. Of course, once you go back into the literature and you look up old hypotheses, sometimes you need to update it with modern knowledge. And of course, the first things we would do is we don't say man anymore when we're talking about humanity. So we would say no person or no human is an island. That would be one update. But if we're also spreading beyond our anthropocentric viewpoint, we might say, well, no organism is an island. And if we're studying what we're studying today, what I'm talking about today, we're going to say no tree is an island. So this is the updated hypothesis from John Donne in 1623. No tree is an island. So what we want to do now is sort of test the plausibility of this it's hard to do this with experiments, so we had to use this Earth system model where we can actually look at the effects of when you remove trees in one place. And so what this shows is basically the hypothesis in detail. The idea is if you remove trees of a region, this will change the surface, the water fluxes and the energy fluxes, and will basically change the surface energy balance. The surface energy balance is what drives atmospheric circulation, so there'll be changes in atmospheric circulation. Circulation is wind moving, and wind moves all around the globe, so this can propagate to other parts of the world and affect remote climates. And as climate changes, the vegetation that lives on that climate will change, so this can cause changes in remote vegetation. So these parts, these three in the middle, are sort of well known in the climate community of scientists. They study these teleconnections. The most well-known one, of course, is El Niño, which is driven by changes in sea surface temperature in the Pacific. So changes in sea surface temperature do all these things, and this is well known and understood, but people have realized recently, well, there's no reason you couldn't have these same kinds of things generated by changes in the land surface as well, which are more fixed in some sense, but still can have these same mechanisms. Okay, so then the research questions sort of flowing from that, no man is an island, no tree is an island are first focusing on the Amazon, what ecoclimate teleconnections originate there, and can knowing about this help us in conservation planning. So, what ecoclimate teleconnections originate with Amazonia? So here's the model experiment. This was, again, done by my colleague, Abby Swan, who's a professor, assistant professor, now associate professor at the University of Washington, and her postdoc, Elizabeth Garcia. And we published this together a few years ago. And the idea was to use a model, in this case, the Community Earth Systems model. And basically, in that model, which models the whole world, of the climate of the whole world, take out the Amazon and replace it with grass. And then here's some of the details. It was coupled to a land surface model. This is the Earth Systems model coupled to a land surface model, the CLM, which it models the dynamics of vegetation. Replace the forest with grass, run for 20 years, and then compare a control run where you didn't remove the forest to the experimental run where you did remove the forest. And in this case, we held CO2 fixed. So this completely removes the carbon effect, which is, of course, what people probably think of first, just to show that there's what the effect is of the water fluxes and the energy fluxes. So basically, here's the idea. This is the change in temperature that was induced by that. Of course, you get red is hotter, blue is cooler. So of course, you get a lot of hotness over the Amazon itself because the trees are not transpiring water and therefore carrying away the latent heat. But we wanted to focus on the remote effects. So let's just black out, white out this region so we don't get distracted by that big red blob, which we knew that there's been a lot of studies about that. And so to focus on the remote regions. So we see these blue and red areas that show up around the world that are the effects of deforestation in the Amazon in other places. So you see this little bit of cooling in North America. I see a lot of warming in Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, some warming around Antarctica, some cooling in Central Asia, North Atlantic, some warming in southern China. And of course, you can propagate this through the vegetation model to the vegetation. And so we can look at the effects of these. There's also precipitation, which I'm not showing here, changes. But those two things together, precipitation changes and temperature changes induced by the loss of the Amazon, induce all these changes in vegetation. So this is change in GPP, gross primary productivity, photosynthetic flux that changes in all these different places due to loss of the Amazon and due to the climate that changes, and then the effects on the vegetation. This isn't showing too clearly, but there's brown and green. So brown areas are loss of GPP. So you get a lot of loss of GPP in the southern Brazil, where this would have be affected by the circulation. You get green up in the central part of the US, which would be kind of good for agricultural productivity, I guess. A lot of different patterns in Central Europe. Some patterns here in Africa as well, and in Australia, India. So the point is, this matters. There's strong teleconnections originating in Amazonia that affect the climate and ecology throughout the world. So one reason to worry about the Amazon, is, aside from the Amazon itself, is that it affects everybody else. No tree is an island. Okay, now I want to ask, well, can we use this to look at conservation? So we haven't done this yet for the Amazon, but we did do sort of a version in North America. So I'm going to show the results from North America and allow you to imagine how we might apply this either in the Amazon or even in Africa as an idea. Once we get to the point of having confidence, this is very cutting edge work, so that we want to study it for a little bit and compare different models. This was one particular model. But in any case, the concept is that if we move particular forests in different areas, we can see how important they are for other areas and compare different forests to each other. We can rank them by how big an impact they have, and therefore, in some sense, how important they are for their connection to other parts around the world. We can ask which forest loss matters most, and if that is the case, we can then guide conservation priorities, perhaps. So this came out last year. I guess our same collaborative group, led by Abby Swan's modeling. And here's again the basic idea, the no tree is an island hypothesis. So this is illustrated for the Pacific Southwest. And here the US has been divided up into regions which are according to we have this thing called the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON, which has these different NEON domains. And so we just chose each NEON domain as a potential source for a teleconnection, and then looked at its impact. So here was the Pacific Southwest. If you remove the forests in the Pacific Southwest, that's where we're having all those fires right now. Been huge losses of forest because of fire the last few years in Southern California. And so this is telling us the effect of that. So you can see this changes transpiration around the continent. Some places get more, some places get less. That affects atmospheric circulation. This is the change in what atmospheric scientists call the 500 millibar height, how high you have to go to get to 500 millibars. It goes up in some places, goes down in other regions. This changes climate. So these are changes in temperature, cooler, warmer, and the ecological response. You see mostly browning through most of the continental US. Some places like the Caribbean are seeing increases. Okay, so then the idea is we could do this for every single NEON domain. And so here you don't need to study all these in detail, but the point is we're doing this systematic assessment of what are the impacts of removing forests in each of these regions all around the continental US. And then we can rank them and look at their impact, and one metric we can use is just its net effect on gross primary productivity when you remove forest in one region everywhere else. So basically if you remove the Pacific Southwest, you can add up all these brown and green areas and see what the net effect is, and do that for every different region, and then rank them. And if you do that, you get a figure like this. So here's the annual change in GPP in the USA, on average, from removing each of these forest regions. So this PS is Pacific Southwest, that's this one. So these are the two extreme ones, the biggest negative impact and the biggest positive impact in terms of GPP on average across the whole US. The biggest negative impact is Southern California. Those forests are really important because if you lose those forests, you have a big negative impact on GPP everywhere. And in some sense, you could say the Massachusetts forests are the least important, because if you remove them, they'll actually cause things to be better elsewhere. I don't want to say that this means that conservation should actually be deforesting there, but anyway, that's the outcome. So anyway, that's the idea is that this provides a framework, a model for thinking and about using science and using the science of ecoclimate teleconnections to help guide conservation. It's not the only thing, but it could be a useful tool in thinking about it. So could we do this? We haven't done it, but could we do this same kind of thing in the Amazon is my idea. We are applying for funding to do this, and hopefully the current environment will make this an important priority. So can we do this to enable science-based conservation in the Amazon? So that's hopefully future work, and that's where that idea is anyway. So I think that may be that's something I'm very excited about. Most of my work has been pretty fundamental science, but this is a place where I see the fundamental science really connecting with practical policy design. So in summary, we have strong ecoclimate teleconnections originating in the Amazonia. We could possibly rank value of forests by their climatic preserving qualities and use this as a tool for conservation planning. And this sort of work shows, and people have done this before, this is a body of work now that's showing that removing forests anywhere can have impacts everywhere, sort of supporting our John Donne hypothesis that no tree is an island. And we're sort of scrambling in some sense to understand the world fast enough to save it, and we want to sort of avoid having to recite the last lines, the modified last lines of John Donne's poem, said not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for trees. So that's our story about the science we're contributing, at least some part of it. Okay, I think the last few minutes I'm going to talk about what is to be done. So Greta Thunberg has sort of made, and her generation is having greater success than we've had in 40 years of talking about this problem in terms of bringing to the public eye the urgency of this problem. And she got together with scientist George Monbiot and made a nice video about what should we do, and they had sort of this three-word answer: protect, restore, and fund. So we can apply that, I think, to the problem of deforestation in the Amazon. protect, which just means in this case, stop deforesting. And this is not just an environmentalist's plea in the wilderness. We know how to do this. Brazil knows how to do this. The solution here is what I call back to the future, which I'll explain more about in a minute. So restore. Much deforested land can be reforested, and this isn't high on the agenda in Brazil in terms of reforesting. But the thing that I was really impressed to find when I came here is it is high on the agenda here in Kenya. It's even written into your constitution that 10% of land cover should be restored to forest. The restoration should be sufficient to bring forest land cover back up to 10%. I guess it's about 7 or 8% now. So this is a great reason to come and travel and meet colleagues in different places, because this is an inspiration that I hadn't fully gathered as a real-life example to something that obviously needs to be done in the Amazon. And fund. Well, obviously we want to fund saving the forests. There's been some mechanisms for doing this. There's this Amazon fund that was started, or at least fundamentally contributed to most by Norway, $100 billion to restore the Amazon. And one thing I want to add to that and emphasize is that needs to not only be direct funding of protecting forests, but also protecting the scientific capacity for restoring the forests. And so it's to stop what I call deforestation's evil twin, which is running rampant now in Brazil, de-education, which I'll say a few words about in a minute. So for back to the future, I just want to call your attention again to this graph and the fact that there was literally an 80% decline in the rate of deforestation over the course of about a decade in Brazil, and this wasn't by accident. This was a combination of enforcement of government policies that were for preserving the forest. There's lots of good policies. This is true in many countries, I think. There's good laws on the books that aren't necessarily well enforced, so just because you have good laws for environmental protection doesn't mean it happens. But here's a case where it happened. The Lula government was committed to this. He got Marina da Silva as his environmental minister, and she was hired around this time, started around this time, and INPA developed, advanced its, let me see, what do I have here? Its remote sensing capacity, not the remote sensing capacity, but the turnaround time. They were able, within a space of a few days, they developed a technique to be able to identify hotspots of deforestation, figure out if they were illegal, and then go to those places and start enforcing, bringing the cops there, the ones for which the party is now ending, according to Bolsonaro. So a few years ago, they changed their forest code. By the way, here's my sort of guesstimate of what 2019 will look like because of Bolsonaro, but we'll get the numbers in a month or so. This actually started this drifting upward. In this year, 2009, Dan Nebstad, my colleague, published a paper in Science that basically asked the question, is Amazon deforestation coming to an end? And he raised the possibility that if we keep this trend up, we could come down to close to zero by 2022 or so. Of course, that has been sadly reversed, not just started by Bolsonaro, but by this change in the forest code that happened here. But just to illustrate where this comes from and how this happened, here's a picture of a day of fire in the Amazon rainforest. So there's this ruralistas, they call them in Brazil, this sort of large-scale agricultural interest in the state of Mato Grosso. They elected a billionaire agribusiness guy governor of Mato Grosso, and he was very tied in with corruption later. But in this region, there was a bunch of these landholders got together and they said, well, let's test Bolsonaro's, who they supported vociferously. Let's have a day of fire. And they organized this apparently on WhatsApp. They said, August 10th, we're all going to go out and start fires. Just to put our noses in the eyes of the enforcement and show that Bolsonaro is on our side. And so this was what happened. Went from 31 fires to 124 fires in this region in one day. And this was actually reported. A reporter got wind of this in this region. I don't know if I have him here cited. and he reported on this like a week ahead of time because he got wind of this and somebody sent him these WhatsApp chats. And he went to the enforcement agency and said, you've got to stop this. But they didn't stop it, and now they've actually had to put him into police protection because his life has been threatened. And Bolsonaro, I mean, this is actually, so this is sort of the kind of thing, this is one example of maybe the kind of thing that's been happening that sort of triggered this big increase. It's not just external sort of economic forces, it's really pulling the gloves off, pulling the leash off of the restraint that was there before. It doesn't have to be that way. Here's a picture of that same state where that day of fire happened over this 10-year or so period. This is the rate of deforestation that was happening up until this big decline period. This is in this state of Mato Grosso, but it reflects the trends that you saw across the whole Amazon. Big declines in deforestation, significant increases in agricultural productivity. Soybean production in particular was going up, cattle grazing was going up. So this is normalized to 2001, so you can see these increases. Soybean production after that 10 years was almost twice what it was at the beginning, even as deforestation was coming down, because of intensification and use of previously cleared forests without having to clear new forests. So again, this is possible. It has been done before in some sense, and also part of this was deforestation-free supply chains. So there's a growing market, a big market for low environmental impact products. So in particular, deforestation-free products. And so this was really, this was the other side of the picture, the other side of the coin from enforcement, and perhaps even more important was the fact that the growing market pressure to do this. And it was but they were sort of hand in hand, and both of them were necessary because in order to have an effective supply chain deforestation-free market, you have to have confidence that when you buy something that's labeled deforestation-free, it is in fact deforestation-free. And for that, you need enforcement, and you need accountability, you need mechanisms, all the things that governance allows you to have, and this is just being trashed by Bolsonaro. And so now some of these same guys who are the ruralistas, who are especially the bigger interconnected folks, are realizing that this may backfire, and this is especially with the surge, it was an incredible surge of global concern about this. It's still not clear to me that whether this will help or hurt it in Brazil, because of course immediately Bolsonaro tapped into this as the world wants to steal our Amazon. And turned it into a patriotic, nationalistic response. This is not your business. This is our country, our land, our forest. Now, of course, all my friends think the same thing too, but they said that's our forest, we need to save it. So anyway, so I don't have too much to say about the reforestation part, but I think Kenya is a great thing I'd like to learn more about your reforestation approaches and the idea that it could possibly be an inspiration in Brazil. I'm especially inspired by these plans I've heard that basically, I guess there's a plan or to some extent it's being implemented, where basically school kids are being recruited to go out and plant trees and then be responsible for taking care of their tree. And this seems to be both incredible workforce, especially in a place like Kenya where there's a huge surge of this age group, and also a great way to model and teach discipline and responsibility and taking care of things. So the last thing, though, is funding, and the next steps are, I've been honored to be a part of this group called Scientists for the Amazon, which has been formed just a couple months ago, led by Jeff Sachs, the international development economist, and Carlos Nobre, who's one of the most prominent scientists, atmospheric scientists and climate scientists in Brazil, who's chairing this group, which is an attempt to bring basically together a science panel for the Amazon, which is sort of informally calling it the IPCC of the Amazon, to promote this kind of things that I'm talking about, evidence-based management. So this is a white paper that was just issued in September that sort of lays out the basics of the science, and we're planning to meet again in Chile, in Santiago, for coinciding with the COP25 to hopefully bring out an IPCC-type report focused on the Amazon by next summer. So this, of course, has a few of specific recommendations, but I want to say a word about this thing that's been particularly uncovered but is completely coupled and linked to the political culture and to the problems of deforestation, which is the problem of de-education. What's happening in Brazil right now to higher education is shocking and really demoralizing. So the Brazilian National Science Foundation in August cut scholarships for 80,000 graduate students and postdocs. CAPES, which is the Brazilian Ministry of Education, responsible for most other scholarships, not just science, but everything else, announced a budget cut of 50% for next year, 2.2 billion reais versus 4.3 billion. Here's one of the INPA, the National Institute for Amazonian Research, one of the gemstones of the crown of research. Brazil has a series of national government labs. This is sort of like DOE labs in the US. They're sort of prominent places for science. And this one is entirely dedicated to understanding the Amazon, its ecology, its function, and this is its budget, the red line going from 2014 down to 2019, close to a 90% cut. So this is research, but this is also funding of scientists, and this is basically, I've never, most of the developed world aspires to build its capacity for education and science, and I'm sure, and you guys are part of that here. And Brazil has done an amazing job of this. When I first went there in 1999, I was part of a Brazil-US collaboration between NASA and the Brazilian Space Agency at that time to study the Amazon. NASA brought its capabilities, satellites, but also funded a huge amount together with Brazil of ground-based work. That's what got me started there. But everything that we did there had to include an element of capacity building, and especially if we could recruit and involve students that were from the Amazon region, as opposed to Brazilians, of course, but not just southern Brazilians, southern Brazil is more like most developed, highly developed regions of the world. It's not developing, but the Amazon is. When I went out to the Mara, seeing the countryside of Kenya was very reminiscent to me of seeing the countryside, rural areas of the Amazon of Brazil. I don't know if there's an example of a country that is deliberately destroying its scientific capacity at the extent and rapidity and magnitude as Brazil right now. It went, and so here's some of the response. Students and researchers at INPA, this sort of gemstone crown jewel did a demonstration in which students put their posters on the outer wall of INPA to show the world what they're doing, and they engaged in this hug by holding hands all around. And they did this at CNPq2 in Brasilia, and so trying to present this. So we're proposing in this scientific framework to include an allocation from, basically the funding requirement is about $1 billion per year, we're estimating, for funding Amazon forest conservation and recovery over the long run. But this should also include what really is going to be a small allocation of capacity development to basically replace these fellowships that are being lost, to replace the capacity that is being lost, to prevent there. Basically what will happen is a lost generation of scientists in Brazil if this continues the way it is now. So I think, pretty much a full hour. This is the last slide showing a poster from one of these demonstrations. País sem ciência e tecnologia é país sem futuro. A country without science and technology is a country without a future. So thank you for listening and participating in our discussion.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Scott. I think we have a few minutes if there's questions from the audience. Yeah, Roland.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm also an ecologist, so I enjoyed it very much. Just maybe a small correction. I picked up in the beginning of your talk, you said that there would be 16,000 tree species in the Amazon, but recent estimates is probably higher. No, globally we think there's about 60,000 tree species. So the estimates have been going up.
Right. This is
Yeah.
from 2016 science paper by Ter
Yeah.
Stege. So
Yeah, but
I don't vouch for it one way or the other, but that's what was reported in the
oh, okay, yeah. But it was the study done by Botanical Gardens
Yeah.
Conservation International in the Global Tree Search. So
for the
no, we
Amazon,
can.
60,000 in the Amazon?
No, globally 60,000. So I
Right.
think probably in the Amazon, you were saying half species in the Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now there's been
Yeah.
some estimate, but recently
Okay.
estimates have been going up. Another maybe a comment, yeah, like you mentioned that there was no plan for restoration, but actually Brazil has been a success story in restoration.
Right.
So maybe what you meant is there's no new plan, no, given
Yeah.
what's happening. And another comment, what I thought you might have talked about a little bit, but I think maybe time was limiting, is about the tipping points.
Yes.
Because we also know that for the same annual rainfall, there can be alternative steady states of
Right.
of vegetation, of woodlands or forests, and the danger then of ending up in an alternative steady state. Now you mentioned the savannas and the forests, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And my last comment, if I may, was that you were talking about using similar modeling approaches that were developed in the US, where you looked at different states and what removing the forest would mean in terms of
Right.
the production. So what would be the danger? Like you talked about the tropical Trump. If you would see a tool like that, and say, oh no, I can plan. I want to deforest. Oh, let me use this as a planning tool where to cut the forest first. So
in terms of going from the other end, in terms of like choosing, the northeast. In that analysis, it says we can cut down the forest in the northeast, and so.
Exactly. Yeah. So sorry, it was a number of.
Yeah, I think that I should say something about the tipping point. It's exactly as you described. In fact, Carlos Nobre, who I mentioned, was one of the first people to do one of these studies in the early 2000s, which sort of identified this bistable state, basically a state that you could have basically a similar climate to what we have today, but would be a stable, low forest regime, a much drier region, a much drier Amazon. And the idea is that if we continue to deforest, we'll push ourselves into that other steady state, and it won't be easy to get out of it just by planting more forests again until you get up to a very high level. And so the work of Nobre and Lovejoy has estimated that a tipping point might be achieved at about 25 or 30% loss of forest cover, and so we're at about 20% now. So this is uncomfortable, given the uncertainties involved, which are large, and given also the fact that we don't even know. We won't know when we're in a tipping point right away. Lovejoy worries that we maybe we overestimated how much needs to be deforested, and maybe we're already in it now, but of course we can't tell right away. But anyway, that this is a concern that we could flip, that it's not just a matter of backing up, but if we go too far by restoring forests, it might be much harder than that because of this bistable case. And yes, there is restoration efforts, but the level of and magnitude of what we need, I think, is what I'm thinking about. And it seems like the thought here is thinking in Kenya is really thinking on a large scale, that maybe there could be convergence. I'll have to look up the recent species estimates. I mean, it sounds like, so if there's 60,000 total and 16,000 in the Amazon, that means 1/4 instead of 1/2. But so,
Yeah, Lee?
So.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My name is Lee Winowicki. I'm a soil scientist, and I don't know if this is the level you feel comfortable working at, but what do you call it? Ecotelemetry?
Oh, eco-climate teleconnections?
Okay, so that was totally wrong, sorry. But so Christine and I were just in the field last week with our farmers in eastern Kenya, and a lot of us here in the room do a lot of interviews with farmers and asking for perceptions of change in climate over time. And I think everyone has heard the farmers say there were more trees, there was more rain, And so our climate has changed less favorably for agriculture. I think it would be very interesting to do this type of analysis. What you said,
Yes, yeah.
in Africa, and I don't know how localized you can do it, but matching it with perceptions of farmers. So for example, I don't know where you were, but in eastern Kenya, there's Chulu Hills, they're volcanic hills that actually had lush vegetation, and the farms have encroached legally into protected areas, and there's much less vegetation. And I just think it would be very fascinating to see how, if it's their how localized or globally these phenomenon are affecting the smallholder farmers. I think there's a huge scope for this work. I was very interested.
Yeah, I was really impressed when we were touring or visiting there. Many people. The people we talked to were, our guides or the guy who was running the camp, talked about this fact of the trees. Losing the trees has lost us precipitation, and that's actually an interesting. I mean, it's sort of where I think the science has maybe arrived late to this in some sense. I don't think we've been sort of hyper focused on carbon in terms of thinking about vegetation and climate interactions until fairly recently, maybe the last 20 years or so, after I got out of graduate school anyway. I don't remember thinking about this in graduate school at all. It sort of has, so that was 30 years ago now. So maybe we're late to the table. Maybe this is a good example of native knowledge that we should have learned from sooner. But it's still, some aspects of it are controversial in the science. There's a question, there's a big distinction between those who say, well, all I've depicted here so far and all that's represented in that model is basically the effects of recycling, in which the rainwater or the transpiration water hitches a ride on where the winds are going. There's also a stream of thought that says that the winds themselves are actually created by the vegetation and is bringing the water from the oceans, and that's a vigorous scientific debate. But the way people talk about it here, or in the West, in the Mara area, the people that I met, small sample size, one case, seemed to have a strong sense that the trees were sort of bringing the water, not just helping recycle it.
Other questions? Yeah, Mahmood.
Thanks a lot, Scott. It's a very interesting talk. I'm just thinking, in the beginning of your presentation, you said, the oxygen and deforestation really do not make much difference, the connection. But in terms of when we are thinking about all these teleconnections, the atmospheric changes and the way winds will flow, and we know that it's roughly the earth-based, not earth, I mean how do you call it, non-oceanic production and consumption of oxygen is in balance, more or less, as of now.
Yes.
But the way we are projecting in the future, the trees are declining, they will decline. I mean, whatever mechanisms are being put in place, these are too slow, responses are too slow. So I just wonder, because for example, I will refer example from India and Pakistan. There's a lot of crop burning, residue burning in India, Punjab state, which affects Pakistan because of the wind flow in winter, November, December, So something similar that makes this, whatever oxygen is available, unbreathable quality or poor in concentration.
Unbreathable, like because of the soot or the pollution.
I mean, are those connections studied or, right? And what would be the implications for that?
Yeah, so the first order implication is human health in terms of soot and ozone and all that stuff, which is, I mean, in terms of things that cause morbidity and mortality, you have to sort of consider like right now, that's the biggest environmental problem there is pollution from burning, mostly not only deforestation, but cook stoves in rural village huts and things. But in terms of the sort of ecological facet. So we started out thinking about trees in terms of carbon, and we've expanded. This isn't the first of this kind of study. We've done some new things with it, but we expanded to sort of think about other aspects of trees that affect the climate, like their albedo, the water fluxes and energy fluxes, like I talked about here. But now there's work that's actually looking at these things like isoprene, volatile emissions, and the other particulate matter, and how those have potentially big climate effects, especially aerosols. So there have been some recent studies along this vein that are looking at the climatic implications of more and more things that trees do, or do if they're burned, are being incorporated as this scope of the research expands to be more comprehensive. And so carbon is now almost becoming old hat, but so.
Yeah, Yvonne.
Thank you, Dr. Saleska. My name is Yvonne Tamba, and I'm a research assistant. So as a student, I think I'm curious mostly as to where the research gaps could be in the science, where we could possibly go into what science we could possibly do in the future that could really contribute to the conservation agenda. Thank you.
Well, like I said, this work is sort of like a new direction for me that I'm actually quite excited about because of its making a connection. I think most of the things that we need to do on the policy front, whether it's stopping climate change, just generally, as a general problem, or the kinds of work that World Agroforestry Center is doing, probably don't need fundamental science as the primary thing. I mean, the limiting factor is not the lack of fundamental science. It's not like we don't understand climate change well enough, and that's somehow limiting how much mitigation we're doing. It's all, social, economic, political, and I think probably, I don't know the science as it relates to development as much, and I suspect that there's actually more role for especially applied science to really help, like this ecoclimate teleconnection modeling, but the work I saw here in terms of your ability to look at soils across the African continent and indeed across the world and understand the relationship between soil chemistry and quality and productivity would really be an important area to, I guess if you're thinking about wanting to do either sustainable agriculture, here I'm getting out of my depth and you guys are the experts, or reforestation, you could imagine programs and metrics and sort of grids, and don't need to imagine, you're doing it, where the science help, if you want to regrow forests, go look at the climate patterns, yes, look at the soil types and quality, yes, and then sort of put those together in a way that says, well, that allows you to rank where you should be most likely to be successful for regrowing forests, and then go there first. But I understand this is actually what you're doing. So I would say if you want to study the science, study that science, study soil science, study all these things in some sense, but then just soils, right? But what are you studying?
Well, my background is in economics.
Mm-hmm. Study economics.
So, yes. So the natural resource economics would be.
But now you're. So what level are you at now, in terms of your trajectory of learning in life?
Well, I've finished my bachelor's, so I'm to go into my master's.
Okay.
So
you're trying to think about what to do next. Yeah.
Yes.
So you have some good economics. That's probably good for this. I learned some economics in graduate school, too. Are you applying to graduate schools now, or are you planning to? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So I think, Tama, that's like a perfect segue into what we were hoping to do. So let's thank Scott again for his seminar.
Thank you.
And I wanted to invite anyone that would like to stay until lunchtime to come on up to the front, and we'll have an informal discussion about grad school, about research, about the talk, anything you guys want. So, yeah, Christine? At what time? Oh, it is? Okay, we have to go somewhere else then. Where can we go?
Also, Mina is listening online and he's now sent a presentation.
Oh, yay. Hi, Mina. Thank you. Okay. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. The gauntlet is down. Okay, so we'll find a space to chat, maybe at Evergreen until lunchtime. So.
Thank you.